My current position is that determinism is actually something that convinces people because they experience themselves as free. And this might be a bit provocative because the point I would be making in the following is that people buy the theory of determinism because they experience themselves as free. Let's unpack this. So, my thinking around this is grounded mostly in George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's theories around embodiment. And on the other hand, I've been fascinated as a kid already how it is possible for every child to learn mathematics. How is it possible that you can enculturize any child into any paradigm that is given? Why can you teach everything? How is it possible, even though they might come from different backgrounds, from different families, that everybody can learn everything? What is universal about us human beings to the degree that we are capable of enacting all of those different forms of human practice? And causality must be one of those universal features because it's universally understood. It is something that everybody is capable of grasping. And if you think about it, even the arguments that are being made pro-determinism don't made by physicists and made by biologists, they don't significantly change the definition of determinism. They basically use a definition of determinism which is very similar to Laplace's demon, right? Where the idea is that the universe is composed of particles, and if you know the movement and the possible positions of all particles in the universe, you can basically predict the course of the universe in toto. You would be capable, you would be in a position of predicting everything, including human behavior. And when people are arguing for determinism, they don't significantly change the definition of causality. And this definition of causality, this mechanistic definition of causality, is something that even small children understand. You don't need to be a physicist, you don't need to be a biologist to understand the idea of determinism. Now, you don't necessarily know all the examples and all the different postulated causal chains that are supposedly out there explaining everything. You might know no examples at all, yet you understand the principle of causality before being a physicist, before being a biologist. How is this possible? How can you understand something before having actually looked into those fields in depth? And my working hypothesis on this one is that in order to understand what causation is, you need a few precognitive assumptions. First of all, the experience of touch, right? When you experience touch, it's not just a random thing, it is actually a very significant thing. Because the moment an organism is capable of experiencing touch, literally something touching your skin, the organism experiences a boundary transgression. The organism, with that experience, positions itself within the body. So the skin has a very special function here. The skin is just not a random phenomenon, and it's not something that's projected. It's something that designates a real distinction in the world, and a very significant distinction. You're somehow within your skin, and outside of your skin, there is something else that impinges on you. That experience is very primary, and that experience is something that we have with animals in common. And yet it's not something that's physical. The experience itself of touch, if you think about it, there is a very clear tipping point from which you start experiencing, oh, now I have been touched. So from a certain moment on, you have a felt sense of certitude and clarity that something has impinged upon your identity. Something has literally bumped into your identity. That's the first thing you need to be capable of experiencing and distinguishing. The idea of identity, the idea that you are one, that you are within your body and your skin. Your skin is your boundary, and outside of that boundary is something else, something other. That's an experience. That's not a theory. That's the way we experience everything. That this is a basic assumption. And this basic assumption, by the way, we then project into the world. Because this experience of unity, of having one boundary, the skin encapsulating us, is exactly the terms and in terms of what we actually try to understand everything else out there in the world. We try to find units, real units in the world out there. This is a process that is not random. It's not a coincidence that most people are doing this. Most scientists try to do this, including even the humanities, and they figured out it doesn't work. It's not a random process, but it is exactly grounded in this experience of unity. This experience of your consciousness being united and having a boundary, somehow being related to your embodiment. That's the first thing you need to understand causation, because causation is a relationship between one element and another element. And units don't exist just simply out there in the world. The notion of unit is not just something that's self-evident. You need to somehow understand the notion of unity, of something being a unit, something having an identity. And this you do with the experience of touch. The moment you feel touched by something, you already have a felt sense for what it's like to be an identity, to be one, as opposed to the world out there. That's the first ingredient. The second ingredient is movement. So you have to have an understanding that when you have a will and you're capable of moving that will in different direction, or let's put it in a different way. Imagine your attention is like, Michael Levin puts it, like a light cone looking into the world, and you're capable of moving your light cone of attention to different spots. The experience behind that is that you can do something, right? There's this distinction between I can and I can't do something. Again, just as everybody understands touch, and nobody needs to be explained like what touch is, everybody understands what the difference between I can and I can't is. The difference is, when you can, you're capable of moving reality by actualizing your will, in other words. So reality is responding to your will. It might be a very physical example. So you're pushing the chair, and the chair is reacting to your pushing movement. Then you can push the chair, and you understand what I can means in this context. But if the chair is not responding to your pushing movement, then you can't. Again, this is such a foundational experience. It's at the heart of everything. I don't think we can even imagine any dimension of reality in which we don't already make this distinction between I can and I can't. It is a meaningful distinction, and however you want to conceptualize it, even if you don't want to call it free will, call it whatever you want. The distinction between I can and I can't is a real one, and a relevant one. This is the second ingredient that you need. You need the conception that there is a connection between your identity, so your personal boundary, and your ability from within that identity to do something, to impinge onto the world, to make a difference to the world through your will. So your will is capable of making a difference to the world out there, to the physical world, and not only directly by pushing and pulling, this is like the primary and prototypical examples for it, but also by calling your mother. You're calling, and mother comes, or she doesn't, right? So there is either a connection, either the world submits itself to your will, and then you can do something, or you can't do something. And both experiences are also, of course, highly laden with emotion. So it's not just, oh, I can, so what? And I can't, so what? But it feels different to you whether you can or you can't, right? You might react with frustration if you can't, particularly if children, obviously, if they're placed in a situation of permanent frustration, they will give up. And giving up is also something that's real. However you want to term it, again, the experience of giving up is real. And the conditions leading to giving up are just as real as reality can get. So this is the second ingredient. You need agency. You need to already assume a notion of agency. This is this sense of your freedom of will impacting on the world. And that's not a theory about the world. It's not, I think of the world as being, something that is reacting to my will. It's not something that you think, but it's something that you experience. You experience the distinction between I can and I can't. And When you can, you say, I'm free to do something. And when you can't, you say, I'm not free. There's some kind of limit, some kind of limitation on my freedom. That's the real distinction, however you want to call it. And everybody, including those who believe in determinism, would agree that this distinction is real. It's something that's real in the human world. And they understand it. And ironically, this is the second ingredient that you need, this experience of being free. And as Husserl has put it, the prototype for freedom, for free will, is attention. In the fact that you feel that you can move your attention from one spot to another spot. This is the primal case, the primal example of all forms of free will. So raising my arm is an expression of free will. Thinking about something, an issue, and pondering it. Knocking 10 times on my head to point out, to make a point to someone else. All of those are expressions of free will, but the root prototype, if you want, of the experience of free will is our ability to focus our attention. We are capable of just sitting there looking at a spot and focusing it. And freedom is exactly that, your ability to move your attention around, your light cone, to move it to a certain spot, to focus it. And your embodiment is basically nothing else but an extension of that focus and locus of attention. It is an expression of this locus of attention. Whatever you do with your body is an expression of that locus of attention moving either freely or feeling impinged by a boundary. And this is something that is experienced by everyone. The distinction between I can and I can't, the distinction between I can focus on something and I can't focus on something. I'm losing my ability, I'm losing my grip on something is real, whether you believe in free will or not. So however you conceptualize it, you have to make at least room for that distinction. You assume this distinction. The third point that you need for causality to make sense as a concept is something like a notion of temporality or sequence. So what's also within consciousness and what's built into every experience that you have is a felt sense that experiences come after certain other experience. There is a sequence of experiences. There is something like the now, the present moment of experiencing, and there is a looking back to experiences that you've had, and the looking forward to experiences that you are about to have. This is also necessary for the concept of causality to make even sense, because causality is not just random connections, but it is a sequence of events, those events being connected to each other, a sequence of occasions appearing and being connected. For this, you have to have a sense of temporality, and many have actually made the point that the consciousness itself, the flow of consciousness itself, the stream of consciousness itself is the extension of that stream of consciousness is what we call time. There is actually no physical reality of time. There is no physical thing called time. But when we think about this, the experience of time itself is grounded in experience. It is grounded in you being able to look back at experiences that you feel are gone, are past, and you being able to look forward into the future, to protend, as Husserl puts it, and anticipate experiences that are about to come from a position of presence. So this third point is the assumption that there is, if you want, the experience of the present, from a physical perspective, the notion of present doesn't even make sense. What would the present be? How long of a duration would the present be? Then the term itself doesn't make sense. To us, on the other hand, the notion of the present makes sense, and it is connected to the notion of presence, of being there, of being aware. The notion of the present is derived, I believe, from the notion of presence. But it's I'm not sure about that. But I think it might be a point worth making. However, the point we need is the notion of temporality, again, of sequence. And then we can combine this with a fourth element. The fourth element is the hypotheticals, right? The experience of what would have happened if I had done something else, right? What if something else had been the case? The moment you introduce that into the picture, and not all beings are capable of that. Actually, most animals are not capable of performing hypotheticals. There are even certain cultures I've read where this is not an easy task. You're asking people to think in terms of hypotheticals, and they just can't get the idea of what you want from them because they look at concrete reality. Like the concrete operational phase in Piaget in child development is linked exactly to this concreteness of things. Things are concretely given. So ideas and questions like, for example, what would have been the case if I had done this and that? Thinking in hypotheticals, or asking the questions, in what way could I possibly be wrong? So playing through different scenarios in which you think about, I do A, what are the possible consequences of A? This is not something that is easily given to all children. Children have to learn this. There is a developmental phase they have to go through before they're actually capable of hypothetical thought. But this is the thing that you need if you want to have a full-fledged notion of causality. So you need all those four elements. And those four elements are all expressions of consciousness. They're all expressions of subjectivity. So touch, the experience of something impinging on your boundary, you experience yourself as an identity, is a subjective experience. This is something that we all have in common. The second one, the notion of agency, the idea that, well, it's not an idea, it's an experience. The experience that you can and that you can't. This distinction is foundational. You need that as well. The third one, which is temporality, which is that something is before something else. Certain experiences are before other experiences. And combined with the notion of the hypothetical, what if that had been the case? If you combine those four, you have a basic conception of causality. And this is how we think of causal relationship. Causal relationships are between identities. If you look out into the world, there are no things that are just, pure identities. And this has been pointed out in science of the 20th century, criticizing mechanistic such concepts of causality and thinking, in pointing out that whatever you took to be a unit, an identity, actually, if you look at it and take it apart, you see it's filled with gazillions of smaller parts in it. It's never just simple. So why would you even assume that it's simple? Well, the assumption that it's simple, that it has a boundary, and it's just one thing, comes exactly from this experience that we experience ourselves as being one, as being a unified field of consciousness that is situated in your body. That this is at least my speculation here. Otherwise, it would be weird. I mean, why is the idea that this is not just an idea that a few people came up with, right? To look for atoms in the world out there. This is a massively popular idea across generations, across different cultures. The idea that you can look at something as an individual, as something that is a unit, right? And treat that as impinging on something else. And the impinging part, again, the part when unit A touches unit B and forces it to do something, which is at the heart of causality and thinking about causality, is based on the experience of agency, of human agency, and the conception of you being free. Because what's happening here is that on the one hand, one identity, and again, this is rooted in your experience of identity. It's not rooted in the reality of identity. Because again, if you look at the world, as Alan Watts once put it, like, where do you know the flower ends and where do you know its environment begins? I mean, this is maybe a stupid example, but systems theorists have been pointing this out as well, that most of the boundaries that we treat as real are actually, they're fluid. And there are pluralities where we usually assume unity. And that assumed unity, again, I think comes exactly because we experience ourselves to be unified and to have a skin, to have a boundary. So we assume things out there to be skin-like, to have a skin, to have their own identity, and to have their own agency. And this is crucial. Without the notion of agency, the notion of free will, you couldn't understand the notion of causality. Because the touching part, the part where one element touches another element and makes it do something, you can only understand when you understand the notion of agency. As a human being, you wouldn't be even able to understand what it even means that something touches upon something else and impinges on it if you didn't have the embodied experience of agency, of your will acting into the world and making a difference. Your experience of your will making a difference to the world is what we project out into the world, in assuming that the movement of one object, the object is the skin-like thing and identity, impinges on and makes a difference onto another object. That's a human concept. Well, not just human, it's a subjective concept. It's a concept about experience and about consciousness. It's not a concept about experience not like reality out there. And the same thing with the notion and the idea of sequence or sequence of experiences, so that something is before something else. And the notion, what would be the case, the hypotheticals, what would be the case in the world out there if object A hadn't bumped into object B, but if object C had bumped into object B. So all those four elements that you need to understand causality are understood basically by most children from a certain age on. They don't need to be physicists. They are taken for granted. And it is kind of ironic that when you come up with a theory that denies the second principle, which is agency, you kind of are making, as far as I see, the performative contradiction here. Because you're denying, by denying the notion of free will, you're denying the second principle, the distinction between I can and I can't, to be real. On the other hand, you're assuming it to even be able to understand the concept of causation. You wouldn't be able to understand the notion of causation if you didn't understand the distinction between I can and I can't. And of course, the I can assumes the I. You have to understand what I, or identity, means in the first place, which is kind of point one, the touching point. Those you assume, right? And my speculative assumption here would be, that's the reason why people find determinism so convincing. People find determinism so convincing not because it's a solid theory that gives you good predictions. With the notion of determinism, think about it. We have not been able to show any kind of close connection between the micro realm and the realm of politics. So, for example, you can't make really strong connections between what you see is happening on a molecular level and what is happening in the political world. So that you know, oh, this is because those and those molecule patterns exist, people voted for this candidate in politics. Such connections, or connections between historicity or between psychology or sociology, whatever you want, or any kind of other social system, or even the educational system, such cross level of description connections are basically impossible to make. Like, nobody can make really good predictions. I mean, if they could, they would be able to make the perfect political candidate, right? If you had a good understanding of everything by just knowing the features of the micro, you could make perfect predictions about basically any area of human activity. You could predict who would win a presidency, a president's race. You could predict who would become a successful scientist. Everything that's out there. Those connections don't exist. And we know that people who are hyper-specialized in one area usually don't necessarily, with that, have a better understanding of basically anything else. In all the other areas that you could be smart in, they usually are just as much of a dilettante as anybody else. Sometimes it makes them even stupider because they run into the world with certain assumptions about how supposedly the world has to work. So despite of us not being really able to have a solid, really well-founded understanding of human behavior as a whole, yet we find the idea of determinism extremely convincing. And my speculation here, and this is something I thought of recently, why it is so convincing is because we basically are reading our experience of free will into the notion of causality. We're taking our experience of agency, and when you read determinism, so typical descriptions of how supposedly the world is determined, and we see, oh, there are these agents. Well, not we don't use the term agent when we speak about determinism, but there are those units which make a difference to other units. We understand that and feel close to that and feel attracted by that theory because it is an expression of our subjective experience. It is an expression precisely of the free will that we're denying. It is an expression of precisely the agency that we then suddenly don't have a terminology for anymore. Because in the world of this descriptive determinism, there is no possible space in which you could even name the distinction between I can and I can't, right? So the distinction that we use to understand the notion of causality itself, you can't even name within a system of deterministic thinking. It doesn't have a vocabulary for that. It's like saying, well, love, or whatever other term of this designating subjectivity you might take, those terms don't exist within a deterministic language, and the language which speaks of objects and object relationships. You couldn't even name the experiences and assumptions that you make to even understand the deterministic position. And I've rarely heard this being expressed by anyone, but I think it's pretty obvious. If you just make this side tour and think about how do you come to understand the notion of causality? It's not just a given, it's not just evident. You can't throw it to an animal and say, here, let's believe with me in the notion of determinism. An animal wouldn't buy that. Why? What's different with the animal? So you have to have certain assumptions there. You have to have certain shared experiences. And at the end of the day, it seems those experiences include the experience of agency. You just can't, I don't think you can think the notion of causality without already assuming a felt sense of agency. It is like reinterpreting yourself. It is very much like people are reinterpreting the Bible to read certain experiences into it. We are silently reinterpreting the notion of determinism to mean to us something different than it actually literally means, right? Because literally it doesn't have a language for agency in it, built in it. Literally there is no space to even express the distinction between I can and I can't. And yet on a metaphorical level, this is what we assume to understand what we usually think about to be causality, as I just broke it down into those four elements. I'm not sure whether it's not more, but I think those four are involved. I think you need those four to grasp the most simple, and there are different definitions and different variations of causality, but I think as far as I can tell, most of them actually share those four categorical foundational experiences to be there. You have to have those four elements for any notion of causality to actually make sense. And I'm not sure even if I feel like I'm missing something important here, but those four I think are basic. So yeah, that's the point. Yeah, it sounds weird if you just tell it to people. But if you break it down, I don't think it is just as weird, because all we have done is we've just included the human subjectivity that has to be there for you to understand the notion of causality, because the notion of causality is not self-given. It's not self-evident. It's not something objective. It is something construed in some mind. So the mind has to have gone through some kind of process of understanding. And if you just look at that process of understanding as a process of understanding, you will be surprised how much has to be there actually to even understand the most simple things.